I want to thank everyone for coming. We have a small group, but that's actually really nice because it's a little bit more intimate, and I do want to steal a page from Gary Vee and do some Q&A at the end. So number one, remember this is live, so don't leave me hanging with questions. And number two, having a smaller group means that we can dive deeper into a lot of the more specific things that you guys may have over your businesses. So the title of this talk was 5 Steps to Land Your First Client. But really, as I was developing the talk, I realized that's false. Really, it should be the 5 requirements to land any client or customer. And so this isn't just B2B. This is any situation where you need to sell a product to an end user consumer. And I believe that there are these 5 requirements that you need to meet, almost like steps in the process, in order to close that sale. But only 3 of them are actual steps, and then the other 2 are more skills based. So they're things that you need to audit yourself and figure out whether or not they're a part of your wheelhouse. So those 5 things are: number 1, a product, which may seem obvious, but we'll dive into that a little bit. We need a buyer, and then we need exposure. And that's really all that is required. You need those 3 things: a buyer, a product, and exposure, and you're able to land a client, make a sale, etc., etc. However, you also need these 2 subcategories, and these are the things that are skills based. So you have the ability to close, and you have the ability to deliver. So let's dive into a little bit of all of this. So what is a product? A product is simply something that someone else values enough to sacrifice for. And if you think of any product in the entire world, anything you've ever bought, anything anyone in society has ever bought, it's simply because they value having that thing more than they value the dollars that they exchange for it. So at its core, that is the definition of a product. And if we need a product in order to land a sale, that then raises the question for many of the people in this room: what is my product? What is it that I'm trying to sell? And so I'm going to save you a little bit of time, because there's really only one product that any of us sell, and it is a combination of time and accessibility. And what I mean by that is fairly simple. So let's look at Uber, one of my favorite examples. What does Uber sell? Anyone want to take a gander? Yes, Sophia. Convenience, exactly. But they also sell time and accessibility. So how Uber made their money, how they popped up and became such an enormous phoenix, is simply by combining time. They allow people to call a cab when they're actually ready to go. And especially in a city like New York City, they know that a cab will be there in 5 minutes or less. They allowed people to do so in the convenience of whatever life situation they were in. So if they're at a bar, they don't have to worry about going out and hailing a yellow cab. They don't have to worry about walking 3 blocks to get to a main road to stand there and hope that somebody stops, because there's 50 other people from that same bar waiting. And they also don't have to worry about calling a regular black car service, which might take 20 minutes. So Uber sold their time back, they sold their convenience, but they also sold accessibility. Because as I just mentioned, black cars have always existed. Like, Uber did not invent the black car service. You could pick up the phone and call, but by putting it through a mobile app, something that's automatically in our pockets and 2 clicks away, by doing things like placing their credit card options and into a prepaid system, so you never have to re-edit it every time you call a new car, it just automatically charges it. They're selling convenience. And the same example holds for companies like Airbnb, Netflix, and even my own company. If we want to look more on the client side rather than the consumer side, my company, Auto Digital, we sell time, convenience, and accessibility back to our clients, in the sense that we save them time week to week in producing their episodes. We sit down and we identify the processes and the systems that make episode submission and podcasting as a whole easier, which is therefore convenient for them. And we do so in a way that is entirely accessible, because we have built out those systems and made submission of the files easier, rather than dealing with a million different tools that they currently do. So we took a system that was broken, we built a process around it to save them time, convenience, and accessibility, and as a result, we were able to close clients. So everyone in this room who is trying to sell a product, and everyone watching on Facebook Live and in the replay of this video, your job is to build a product around those three things: time, convenience, accessibility. And I'm going to say those over and over again because I want to make sure it's drilled into your head. The only product are those three things. Everything else is just the package that you deliver it in. So Uber's product is time, convenience, accessibility. The package they deliver it in is car services. Airbnb's product is time, convenience, accessibility. The package they deliver it in is on-demand rooms. And so that's the basis we start from. Our product is those three things. From there, we need a buyer. So again, what is a buyer? A buyer is simply the person who values those three things enough to sacrifice for it. However, in order to identify who your buyer is, and in order to figure out the packaging for that product, the time, convenience, accessibility, you need to sit down and identify a group of people that you want to serve. Because that's ultimately who your buyers are going to be. They're people who are a part of a community, whether they are young entrepreneurs or they are everyday 9-to-5ers looking to make a leap or whatever it is. You need to be a part of that community, speak to them, and understand what it is they value, what package they want that combination of time, convenience, and accessibility in, because that's when you're able to develop a product. So again, going into some examples, with my own company, Auto Digital, we knew that new podcasters specifically, especially ones that had a business tied to it, were super busy and did not want to deal with the technology around podcasting. So we knew that the product potential was there for selling them time, convenience, and accessibility. However, we didn't know what form that was going to take. We could only figure that out by sitting down, making calls, and talking to people in the podcasting community and figuring out these are the things they value, these are the problems they deal with, and this is the package we need to deliver that product through. And so that took the form of a done-for-you service. That's also taking the form of a consulting product we're going to launch next week. And in a couple of months, that'll take the form of a software product that we're launching. Because these are all things that our clients and the community around them have told us they value. And as a result, we are now taking time, convenience, accessibility and packaging it through those product ideas. And we know there's going to be sales for it because they've told us that this is what they value. So that second piece of identifying a buyer is also required to figure out what your packaging is. You already know the product. I've said it 17 times so far, but you don't know the packaging for your audience. You don't know what it is they care about, what it needs to look like for them to realize that these are the things they value. And so your job now is to identify the group that you want to serve, be a part of that group, and figure out what it is they value so that you can create that product for them. And then finally, you need exposure. And this is the part that is hard. This is the part that Gary Vaynerchuk and Tim Ferriss and Seth Godin and all of the big marketing people that we all know and look up to, this is the part they talk about when they say hustle. Because exposure comes in two forms, and for a new product, a new company, you need to do both. So you do need the inbound, you do need the content, you need the videos, the posts, the Instagram photos, the Snapchats, all of the things that we all do and say we are hustling. Like, we need to do that, but we also need to spotlight the product itself, and that's where outbound comes in. And that's the part that a lot of people have forgotten, because we've moved into this internet age where you can build a product and create content and attract people, but that takes 6 months, that takes 8 months, that takes 10 months. And if you want to leave your job tomorrow, or if you are in a position like I am where your entire income is relying on landing a client, you don't have 6 months. So you need to be aggressively reaching out as well. And this is where things like cold calling, cold emailing, email blasts, all of those old school sales tactics come into play as outbound strategies, while simultaneously doing the inbound strategies, because 6 months from today, they're going to pay off. And so you need to build both at the same time, but you can't do any of that until you have the first two pieces, until you know who the audience is, and until you know what package they need their product to be delivered through. And so all of these three things are incredibly important to land your first client. They are absolute requirements, and there's nothing, you're never going to see a difference or a change until you start thinking about them in the way that I've outlined. But in addition to all of that, you also need to audit yourself and figure out who you are. Because in order to land a client or land a customer or any of the things that actually lead to revenue, that actually lead to being able to change our lives and go full-time on our companies and follow our passion and all of the things that we as a community like to say, but many of us don't get to do. The only way that we do that is by actually closing that sale. And not everyone can do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it is a fundamental truth that not everyone has the ability to sell something. And so you need to look at whether or not you are one of those people that can. And if you can't, then myself, Gary Vee, and multiple other entrepreneurship leaders, not including myself in the leader area, we all suggest that you then look to somebody who can. Because you should not be trying to sell something if you have absolutely no skill in sales. Like there is a talent that is required to do it consistently and well, and it's a process that I'm still trying to figure out to this day, and I've been self-employed now for 11 months at this point, and that is all I do every single day. But I'm still trying to figure out what is the cadence, what is the right approach, how do I build a system that drives this long term. So and that's with having the ability to sell something. That's actually one of the only things I'm pretty good at. Everything else I end up outsourcing because I'm just not as good at them. And so you need to audit yourself as to whether or not you're the person that delivers on a product or somebody that sells a product, or maybe you do both. But that sale requirement is absolutely necessary. And then beyond that, there's the ability to actually deliver. Because I don't think anyone in here or anyone watching wants to be the person who sells a product and then runs with the money. Like I think that by the nature of watching this video or showing up to this talk, that you are the type of people who want to sell a product and serve the person who bought that product. You want to sell a service or a t-shirt or event tickets, whatever it is, you want to sell it and actually deliver on that promise that you've made. And so you need to look at whether or not the product you're selling, the package that this audience requires, is something you can deliver on. For me, we sell done-for-you podcasting services. Now, I can deliver on audio production, but I'm not as good at copywriting and writing the blog posts around podcasts. And so I've outsourced that piece in order to make sure I can still deliver a high-quality product. Now, that means it eats into my profit margin and I take home less. But my clients are happier, which means they recommend me to more people, which just spirals into more work. And I also feel good about the product that I sell, which means that I'm much more amped to sell it every single day because I feel good about it. And I know that the person on the other end is going to get something of value from it. And so you can be either somebody who is able to sell or somebody who's able to deliver, or you can potentially be both, but you need to figure out where you land on that spectrum. And the way you do that is by sitting down and sending the cold emails, creating the content, landing a client, delivering on that, doing work for free, whatever it is to get yourself into that pattern of working on these 5 core things. And so I want to bring it back to the main point of this talk, because you need to figure out whether or not you can sell, you need to figure out whether or not you can deliver, but ultimately none of it matters if you don't have a product, if you don't have a buyer, and if you don't have exposure around it. And I think the biggest point in that is simply that you need to remember that the only product is time, convenience, accessibility. Realize that any way that you deliver that is simply just the packaging around that. Ultimately, what the end user is buying is their time, their convenience, their accessibility, or if it's a consumer product like a t-shirt, then we can add more things into there like identity and brand, and none of that's that important for clients, at least where we are in our businesses. So realize that your product needs to be around those three things. Those are the things pretty much everybody values right now. And from there, find your community that you're going to serve and actually be a part of it. I can't tell you how many people I talk to on a day-to-day basis who say they want to build a business and want to build this product and want to do this, but they aren't a part of that actual community. And so they're building something just out of their own head that they think the audience wants, that they think is valuable. And as soon as they launch it, nobody buys because it's not actually important to them. And so be a part of the communities that you're serving. Actually communicate with people. Take the time to message people and use social media to talk to them and figure out what that packaging looks like. And then from there, your job is just to blow it up as far as content goes and as far as direct one-to-one outreach goes, which is your outbound. And that'll put you in a position to figure out those other two. But ultimately, to land your first client, which was the title of this, it's those 3 steps. And I would love to hear where you all feel you are on that process, and if there's any way that I can help you figure it out. So at this point, I want to open it up to any potential Q&A on anything we just talked about, or your specific to your business or product or where you are in your stage, and we'll see where we go from there.
So I have basically I identify myself with the closing and how it can be hard. For most people, closing can be hard because it's that moment. It can get a little bit overwhelming, maybe a little bit intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any suggestions with closing? Because I know that you have to get on their level and you have to make it about them.
Yeah.
It's not about you.
Yeah.
So that's what I get from the closing.
Yeah.
Anything that you want to add to that?
So for those listening on the podcast, the question is, what are my suggestions for that closing process and pitching in general? Ultimately, what it comes down to is, as you said, getting on the other person's level. So the beauty of sales is that it is a one-to-one process. So the product that you're selling can mold to the actual needs of the person. So the first step is to figure out what those needs are. And the beautiful thing about people is that they will tell you. You don't have to guess. If you ask the right questions, if you seriously care about what it is they're doing, they will tell you exactly what they're struggling with and what matters to them. Once you understand that, once you know what it is they are struggling with, what is their pain point, whatever words you want to use to describe it, once you understand who they are and what matters to them, then it's just a process of showing them that the thing you've developed solves that problem. And once you've gotten to that point of explaining, showing it to them, whether it's through a demo or a free trial or whatever it is, once you've gotten to that point, you just have to ask. And that's the part that I think people get intimidated by, is just that process of working up the guts to say the equivalent of give me money. Yeah. But it's just one of those things that comes with practice. You have to do it the first time, and then you have to do it a second time and a third time, and it's pretty much always going to feel awkward. And eventually you'll get to a point where you're selling bigger ticket items and it'll feel awkward to ask for that amount of money, and you'll try to convince yourself that this is ridiculous, and you just have to work through that, and that's part of being a closer. And so my advice is sit down and listen to the other person and figure out what they want, because that gives you ammunition that you can then use to help in that closing process. But then from there, you just have to ask. So that's what I'd say to that. Yeah.
Do you use forums a lot, or do you use like Facebook?
Mm-hmm.
Forums very strong.
Yeah. So the question is, do I use forums or Facebook groups, and specifically towards forums, like how are they currently? My answer is that it depends entirely on the industry. For me, forums aren't a very big part of my process. In my opinion, the new version of forums are Facebook groups, and depending on the niche, there are some very active groups, and that's actually been a massive lead source for my business. So Facebook groups are the first place I would suggest anyone that is trying to just get their first client, or just trying to be a part of the community. I would suggest they look there. Forums, so specific industries still value forums a lot. I know photography forums are very active, video forums, a lot of creative professions, their forums are very active. But for my process, I don't personally use them, to answer the question. So really just do the research on your industry and figure out, like, is this where they are hanging out, or are they hanging out on Twitter, or are they on Facebook groups? Where are they? And then be a part of that community there. Yeah?
I had a question about I guess, coming to terms whether you're a good seller or not, where your strengths and weaknesses lie.
Yeah.
With that said, at what point do you determine whether you are a good seller, or let's just say, we'll look at the negative side, let's say you're not a strong seller. How do you determine it's you, or maybe it's the packaging, which needs to change?
Got it.
That could be a fine line too.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. Again, for those of you listening, the question is, how do you determine whether it's your skill as a salesperson versus the value of the product, the packaging? So I would say it just comes down to experimentation. If I was in that situation, I think you kind of know if you're not taking them through a sales process well, and if things are sort of bumpy. But let's take that out of it and assume that you have no idea and you think you're amazing. Really, it just comes down to working on the product, working on figuring out what that product looks like, what it does for the audience, and continuing to do those interviews that you were doing earlier to figure out what that version should look like to begin with, and sort of validating it outside of the sales conversation. In addition to that, also continually going through the sales process. And I think from there, you'll get enough information to be able to tell. So either if on one hand people are saying, this is the exact product I'm looking for, like, can I buy it? And then after they say, can I buy it? You talk to them and all of a sudden they're not interested anymore, it might be you. But if they're saying on this end, this is phenomenal, like, I would give you money for this right now, but then during the sales process they're dropping off, then from there it does become a question of, is it my sales process? Because unfortunately, like, it's one of those things that you just have to look at yourself. Like, you really just have to pay attention to how you come across when you're dealing with people, and that's one of the things with sales, is it's a very people-driven activity. It's one of the most people-driven activities out there, careers. And so if you constantly feel nervous when you're talking to other people, then you may not be a great salesperson. If people are enjoying the process, but then you pitch the product and they're not interested, then it may be the product. So just experiment on both ends and try to find that fit that you're able to say with relative confidence that it's one or the other. And the product should always be evolving either way. So constantly be getting feedback on that front.
And what's your opinion on, like, market research? Just to give an example, like, I know bigger corporations, businesses, my own company does this, where they have surveys after either some type of service is rendered, whether it be actual services where they install the service or provided a service, or customer service. Now, on smaller scale businesses, it doesn't always make sense to do an email blast of, here, take the survey.
Right.
But to get some kind of feedback, to ask maybe 2 or 3 questions to maybe one place for the product and
Yeah.
packaging the product, and one towards the sale or that whole experience. Is that valuable? Is that something you would ever implement down the
Right.
road?
So just to clarify, the question is market research for smaller teams and companies that maybe can't afford to deploy against it the way Walmart could, for example. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Cool. So what I do specifically in client services, I check in with my clients monthly. So that's where I get my feedback from. Is sitting down with them on the actual phone or Skype, I guess, and talking to them about how I can be helping them better, what it is they're actually getting out of this process and in this product, because that then helps me define my product overall and land new clients. And ultimately just what can I be doing better? And I always assume that there is something that I'm not doing as well as I could be. And there's something that is not as effortless as it is in my mind for them. And so sitting down and talking to people is the way that I would advise any small client services business to do it. If you're on the consumer side, which maybe some people watching this are, what I'd suggest is running surveys, but being very smart about how you deploy them. So on the consumer side, many companies, in order to drive their sales, have an email marketing system set up, have the very basics of automated marketing, and so just plugging those types of surveys and questions into that already established funnel at the points where they make sense. So after a purchase has been made, or 3 weeks after a client or a customer should have received their order, them getting an email or even a letter in the mail, like just asking them to fill out this 2-question survey, like that is extremely valuable. And ultimately, to answer the question, yes, everyone should be doing that type of market research. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't, but the only way you improve is to be open to that feedback and assume that there's something you can do better. Cool. You guys have any questions? Yeah.
Yes, not really related to the process,
Uh-huh.
or on a personal level.
Yeah.
So you say you've been running your business for 11 months?
So I've been running it full time for 11 months. I've really been doing it for about 2.5 years.
Okay, yeah. So I wanted to ask, how was that transition from moving from part-time to full-time? What was was that an easy one? Did it involve a lot of market research?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, what was my transition like switching from working on my business part-time to working full-time? For me, it was surprisingly difficult and not difficult at the same time. And what I mean by that is, prior to taking the leap and going full-time on my business, I had, like I mentioned, been working on it for 2.5 years. And during that time, I was putting in the equivalent of 2 full-time job hours per week. And so switching didn't feel weird because I didn't have to increase my hours on the business side. I pretty much just decreased the hours on the job side. But the more difficult piece, I think, is in mindset. So one of the things that was hardest for me to wrap my head around, and I'm still sort of struggling with now, is the realization that your time, what you spend your hours on, ultimately is not what the client cares about. What they care about is the result. However, in a full-time job environment, you are essentially graded on being there for 8 hours or 9 hours or whatever it is. Exactly. So ultimately, in an entrepreneur environment where you're working full-time on this, it's your choice how you spend your time. All the client cares about is that this gets done, and it gets done on time and well. And so that screwed me up a lot, because for the first 6 or 7 months, I kept having trouble wrapping my head around, at this point I'd increased how much I was working. I now wake up every day at 5 a.m. and I end work around 7:30 or 8. And so I'd increased my hours that I put into the business, but I felt really bad whenever I took breaks and whenever I had entire days where I was just burned out and needed to relax. because I was still in the mindset of I need to be sitting in the chair and working for this many hours. Ultimately, what ends up mattering, like I was saying, is getting the client's job done, but then also doing the things that land new clients. Everything else can either be outsourced or done by other people, or you can build a team around. But really, that's been the biggest sort of transition for me, is realizing that what I call ass in chair time isn't what you're graded by anymore. Cool. Anybody else? Cool.
How much time on a daily basis do you put into email and cold contact, and what is your day look like in terms of time?
Okay, so the question is essentially, how do I spend my time, and how does that break down into outbound activities? So I break up my weeks rather than my days. So Mondays are purely production days for clients, because most of their episodes release on Tuesdays. So by working on them on Mondays, and I'm usually a week ahead on shows, but by working on them on Monday, I'm able to get it done early enough to send back to the client and get everything back. So the entire day Monday is mostly just that. Tuesdays and Thursdays tend to be the days that I do outbound stuff, and that I don't spend the entire day on, but it's a combination of things. So my main outbound activities are emailing, Facebook messaging, and reaching out in groups. So being a part of the community, commenting, all of those things. And so how that ends up breaking down is emailing takes up the bulk, because that has been one of the biggest immediate drivers. It's kind of depressing because you get so many no's and no answers and all of those things, but every now and then you get one, and that's really all it takes to start the engine moving. So that takes up a big bulk, I would say 4 hours. Then from there, it's Facebook, which I'm sort of in and out constantly throughout the day, but that's also been the number one driver of clients and client acquisition, is not sharing in Facebook or sharing content or any of those things, but being a part of groups, realizing that if I'm in 5 groups, at least once a week, somebody posts in that group that they need podcasts edited, and I can immediately jump on and reach out to that person. So looking for those opportunities where my product aligns with what somebody needs, or is close enough to what somebody needs that I can jump on the phone with them. And then from there, it's just, like I said, scanning through the groups. So really, I would say 6 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays goes to purely just prospecting work. And I between Tuesdays and Fridays, I try to schedule as many calls as possible, because one of the metrics that I've measured is the more calls I get on, even if they're not specifically sales calls, the more client work that ends up coming to me. And one of the reasons for that is I audited myself, and I realized that I'm very good on the phone, and I'm very good with presenting on the phone. And so if I can get somebody who's closely related to my end client, whether it's a new podcaster who maybe can't pay me yet, or somebody who just wants some advice to grow their show, if I can get on the phone with them for 10 or 15 minutes, that leads to an introduction, which leads to a client. And that exact pattern has played out for me 3 or 4 times. So that's how my weeks and days end up being broken up between outbound production of existing work, and I'm actually, for the company, just starting to roll out content. And so I foregoed content for the first 10 months because my first goal was I need to be able to pay rent next month. And so I focused everything on outbound strategies. Now I'm in a place where I'm a little bit more capable of divvying up my time. And so I see enormous potential in inbound. And so now I'm going to start leveraging a massive amount of my time towards that. And that's part of the reason I started the process of waking up early and working longer, is I need the time to do that. So that's the best answer for that, I guess.
I was actually surprised. I saw you on Instagram. I was like, Gregg's on Instagram? You know, I went. I saw that you had posted that you had done a new episode. And on my way here, I ended up listening to it. Sometimes I forget.
Yeah.
And the inbound stuff reminds me.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely. I mean,
this-
so one of the beauties of inbound is it can actually aid the outbound process. So what I mean by that is every time you email anybody, it should be with something of value. And so you never want to pitch somebody on, hey, buy my product immediately in an email. You want to still try to build some semblance of relationship and just get them to understand that you're a real person, basically. Like, that's your only job, is I'm a real person. I'm not going to spam you. Like that's the only thing that you should be worrying about. And so having content, having that inbound allows you pieces that you can send to people as value. And so if I email Joe at XYZ company tomorrow and he responds to me, and I know I've done my research, so I know Joe at XYZ company is interested in advertising around content marketing. So if I find an article then 2 weeks from now on advertising, I can email Joe and say, hey, I know you care about this. Here is this article, I just read it. It's really interesting because of these 3 points. Like, check it out and let me know what you think. And that builds a little bit of an understanding between me and Joe that I'm a real person, he's a real person, and we can have a conversation without him feeling pressured. So inbound is a beautiful thing. It's just really a matter of where are you right now and where should you deploy the majority of your time. I saw you had a question, Will?
Yeah, so essentially, just as you were going over how your schedule is pretty much with cold calls, emails, and whatnot.
For the record, I hate cold calling, so I never do that. But I cold email and then try to get on the phone afterwards.
Yeah, I don't like it either. But that said, it is a method that, have many
It can work,
businesses
yeah.
still stick with. That said, though, that being an entrepreneur, being self-employed, you have a schedule set up, and it's great. You may love what you do, and this may be your passion, but don't you find that, or maybe you've mastered it, that you can get a little too lost in the work, that you just spend every hour of every day doing this work, and at that point, the way I look at any kind of revenue or any kind of return is based on my time and my efforts that I put in. And so, at what point do you pull back and just give yourself a day off, or like how do you manage that? Because I know when you have a lot of influx of work, you're just working.
So I'm a little weird on this because, and I hate that I'm gonna sound so much like Gary Vee right now. I promise I'm not trying to copy him. But I have always been the person that needed to be working on something else for another 8 hours. In college, I was building tech startups, and then I was teaching myself to code. And before that, in high school, I was doing regular internet marketing and launching courses. And back in elementary school, I was selling pencils. And like I've always been the person that needed that thing. And so what I very quickly realized about myself is that when I was working my full-time job, I want the job that I don't have to turn off from when I go home, that I can still be thinking about it and still be figuring things out and still be solving problems, and then go back to work the next day and be able to deploy all of those things I've just figured out. And so I take my breaks when either I want to spend time with my girlfriend, and that's part of the reason that I stop at 7:30 and wake up earlier rather than working later, so I can spend the nights with her, or when I'm actually burned out and my brain stops working, which happens, and I know when that happens and I feel super guilty, but that's when I binge watch something on Netflix and hate myself the next day, but am finally able to sort of jump back into it and work again. So I'm a little weird on that in the sense that I don't necessarily care about a balance between work and life. I want them to be the same thing. So I guess I can't really answer super well, but that's how it's worked for me.
Okay, because I just view it in two ways. One, for me, I just look at it the least amount of hours for the most amount of profit.
Right.
And then this way, if you increase those hours, you increase the profit
Yeah.
also.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm okay with.
Uh-huh.
But then I'm also looking at how are you better serving your business if you're always on? And what I'm meaning, because I posted on NYC, I think it was earlier this week or last week, that Amazon is moving to a 30-hour work week, or they're testing that.
Yeah.
And we also had a discussion how in other countries,
like
it's
France
not,
and,
not this 40 to 60-hour work week that we have here. And they find that it is more productive towards the company's end goal, whatever the product is. So,
So for again, for me personally, it's weird. I believe in things like a 30-hour work week. I think that for the company I'm building and the employees I'm going to hire, I want them to have a base hours of work per week that allows them to work in that way of minimal hours for maximum gain, and still have a life that they can build around that. Because I don't expect them to want to deploy against my company the way that I do. And so for the company I'm building, the philosophy is much closer to what you're talking about, and prioritizing work-life balance, prioritizing the things that matter, and putting employees in a position to be able to actually enjoy their lives as well as building something that's interesting. But in addition to that, so the first thing you mentioned was like minimal hours for maximum gain for those hours, so sort of like an 80-20 type of thing. But you also have to look at it purely from if you're just looking at revenue, as a stepping stone. So for where I am right now, I launched a digital marketing agency for podcasters. There's not very much margin on digital marketing services, but if it gets me enough margin that I can hire a developer and launch the software that I want to launch, that has much more margin on it. But I could never, unless I went and took VC money, I couldn't do that tomorrow. And so it comes down to, this is something that unfortunately requires more hours for maybe not as much revenue than the software piece, but it's a stepping stone to being able to deploy against that. And so in 2 years, 3 years, maybe even a year and a half, I'll be in a much better position because I took the step that was in front of me rather than waiting for some pie in the sky opportunity to fall into my lap. So that's how I view it from a revenue point of view. Company-wise, I do want to prioritize a lot of things. There's a lot with corporate America that frustrates me and is part of the reason I left. And so I'm trying to build a company that is able to build those things for the employees. Yeah.
I remember you were talking earlier about copywriting. I have like this radar going off in my head that's telling me right now copywriting is a serious problem for me. I don't think I'm good at it. I think that's really holding me back right now. I remember you said you outsource yours right now because you had...
Well, I outsource copywriting for my client shows. So specifically, when you produce a podcast, you also produce show notes. And so writing up those show notes is something I can physically do, but is a very difficult process for me. It's very frustrating, and it's just not fun. So I outsourced that piece, and I'm now starting to outsource the production piece as well so that I can focus on growth.
So prior to that, you just dealt with it?
Yeah.
Did your best?
Prior to that, I landed 2 or 3 clients and did it every single day, and did it for my own shows, and it wasn't the greatest quality because I know I'm not as good at it, but the clients I landed were supportive enough that they were willing to sort of deal with mistakes here and there. And so a lot of this comes from communication. The reason they were willing to deal with that wasn't just because they were nice people. It was because, number one, I communicated to them from the get-go that my strength was audio production. And so I can make their shows sound amazing, but show notes might be a little bit lacking. So I communicated that and made sure they understood it. But then also when mistakes were caught, I took care of them immediately. Like, I dropped everything else and sat down in front of my laptop to fix them. And so that dedication, I think, is what allowed them to say, okay, well, he knows his weak points, he knows the problem, and he's willing to go out of his way to fix it for us. So that's enough value to stick with him and help him get to that next stage of being able to do it better. So deal with the things that, especially if it's for clients, deal with the things that you maybe can't do as well right now, and focus all of your efforts on getting to the point where you can hand that off. And it's a lot cheaper than you might think. Like, hiring freelancers is not an expensive thing. You don't have to hire a full-time employee from day one. Everyone that works with me right now is a freelancer. Cool. Any last questions before we wrap up? No? Cool. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming in. I hope this was valuable to some of you. I hope it it's all things you know, but I hope it helped you sort of clarify it a little bit more as far as what you need to be focusing on in order to land that client, start getting paid, and get to the point where you can get rich or do this full time or whatever it is. Like, to be an entrepreneur, you have to sell something. That's the definition of it. So focus on these 3 things: build a product, be a part of your community, blow it up, and yeah, that's really all you need to do. So thank you again. Thank you for you guys watching at home, watching live, listening to the podcast, and that's it.
I went into classifieds, I looked for people who were selling sport bikes, pretended as though I had the money, and I asked them for a test ride. I was surprised when they gave me the keys, but they did. Some of them did, not everybody.